My name is Emma Wilkes, and I was 30 years old when this happened. It was the fall of 2022, one of those crisp Indiana Octobers when the air is sharp and the trees bleed red and gold against an overcast sky. My husband, Josh, thought it would be the perfect time for a family camping trip, and against my better judgment, I agreed. What I didn't realize was that decision would pull us into something I'd only read about in horror stories. Josh had been begging for a break from city life, and he wanted to take our daughter, Claire, who was 6, to Shades State Park. He was excited about hiking the ravines and seeing the Devil's Punch Bowl. I had another motive. I'd heard about the ghost stories tied to the area and thought they'd make a great addition to an article I was writing about local legends. My sister Kara decided to join us after some coaxing. She adored Claire and thought the trip would be good for some quality family time. Kara, at 27, was cautious by nature, the polar opposite of Josh's carefree attitude. I should have listened to her reservations. The drive to Shades State Park was uneventful, though the forest seemed darker as we entered its borders, the sunlight barely piercing the canopy. By the time we reached our campsite near the Silver, Cascades Ravine, the day had taken on a gloomy quality. We parked our RV at a spot nestled in the woods, and Josh set to work building a fire while Claire explored with Kara trailing behind. I unpacked, my mind already turning over the local stories I'd read. It was said that, in the early 1800s, settlers in the area had experienced a series of child disappearances. The children had reportedly been lured into the forest, drawn by singing only they could hear. Some were found drowned in the ravines, others were never seen again. The settlers blamed a witch who lived near the springs. They hanged her, but not before she cursed the land and promised that their children would never be safe. It sounded like nonsense until that weekend. The first sign of trouble came that evening. As we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling silly ghost stories, we heard it. Faint laughter drifting from the woods. Josh, ever the rationalist, shrugged it off as other campers nearby. But there were no other campers near us. Kara stiffened, her eyes darting toward the trees, and Claire giggled. "It's just the other kids," she said matter-of-factly, as if it were obvious. "What other kids?" Kara asked, her voice tight. "The ones in the woods," Claire replied. "They said they want to play with me." My stomach dropped. "Claire, what are you talking about? There aren't any other kids here." "Yes, there are," she insisted. But when pressed, she wouldn't say more. She just stared into the trees, her little face serene in the firelight. That night, I struggled to sleep. The RV felt too cramped, the air too still. Around midnight, I heard faint footsteps outside. I sat up, straining to listen. It wasn't Josh. He was snoring softly beside me. I slipped out of bed and peeked through the window. There was nothing there, just the faint outline of the trees swaying slightly in the night breeze. The next morning, things felt normal again, at least at first. Josh made pancakes on the portable griddle, and Claire chattered away about wanting to explore the pretty trees she'd seen the day before. But Kara pulled me aside, her face pale. "I found something this morning," she said, holding out her phone. She'd taken pictures of the trees near our campsite. They were carved with strange symbols, childlike figures holding hands in a circle, etched deeply into the bark. "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe it's just graffiti." Kara wasn't convinced, and to be honest, neither was I. Something about the carvings felt wrong. I told Josh about it, but he waved us off, saying it was probably just some bored kids messing around. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That afternoon, we hiked to the Devil's Punch Bowl, a rocky, bowl-shaped ravine with steep walls and a trickling waterfall. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. Claire seemed fine, though. She ran ahead, laughing and picking up rocks to show Kara. But then she froze, her eyes fixed on the edge of the ravine. "What?" "Is it, sweetheart?" Josh asked, Catching up to her, she pointed. The kids are there. They want me to play hide and seek. I felt a chill creep up my spine. There was no one there, just empty air and the jagged edge of the ravine. Claire, honey, I said gently, kneeling beside her. There's no one there. Yes, there is, she insisted, stamping her foot. Don't you see them? We hurried back to the RV after that, Josh brushing it off as Claire's imagination. But Kara and I exchanged worried glances. That evening, Claire's favorite stuffed animal, a battered rabbit named Mr. Whiskers, went missing. She was inconsolable, and we tore the RV apart looking for it. Eventually, Josh found it just outside the RV near the edge of the forest. It was soaked and smelled faintly of stagnant water. None of us could explain how it got there. By the second night, the tension between us was palpable. Kara wanted to leave, but Josh refused, saying we were overreacting. It's just a creepy coincidence, he said. There's no such thing as ghosts. That night, everything came to a head. We were sitting around the fire again when the laughter returned, louder this time and closer. Claire stood abruptly, her face lighting up. They're here, she said, running toward the trees. Claire, no! Kara shouted, chasing after her. Josh and I followed, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. We found Claire near a spring in the ravine, surrounded by what I can only describe as ghostly figures. Children, pale and translucent, their faces unnervingly blank. They were, holding hands, forming a circle around Claire, who stood in the center smiling. When they saw us, the children turned, their empty eyes fixing on us. My blood ran cold. Claire, come here, I yelled, my voice trembling. She didn't move. One of the figures stepped forward, and its form began to shift. Its face elongated, its limbs stretching unnaturally. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the woods, and the air grew colder. Josh grabbed Claire, pulling her from the circle. The ghostly children shrieked, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that made my ears ring. We ran back to the RV, slamming the door shut behind us. But the nightmare wasn't over. Symbols began to appear on the windows, scratched from the outside. Those same childlike figures, but now they had no eyes. Shadows moved outside, circling the RV. Then we heard it. A voice, low and raspy, muttering. Words I couldn't understand. It's her, Kara whispered, clutching Claire tightly. The witch. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. The voice grew louder, angrier, until the RV began to shake. I remembered the story. The settlers' children, the spring, the curse. An idea struck me. Josh, give me Mr. Whiskers, I said. He hesitated but handed me the stuffed rabbit. I ran to the stove and doused it with water from the spring that still lingered on its fur. Then, I threw it into the fire. The effect was immediate. The shaking stopped, and the voice let out a scream that reverberated through the RV. The shadows outside began to fade, and the air grew still. When we finally stepped outside, the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. We didn't stay another night. By dawn, we were packed and on the road, leaving Shade State Park behind. Claire didn't say much during the drive home, but every now and then, she would hum a strange tune under her breath, a soft, haunting melody I'd never heard before. Even now, I can't explain what happened that weekend. All I know is that some places are cursed, and some stories are more than just legends. If you ever find yourself in Shade State Park, remember this. When the children laugh, don't follow, and whatever you do, don't go near the spring. My name is Ryan Caldwell, and I was 36 years old when I encountered the Hollow Man. It happened in late November, just as the last of the autumn leaves were falling, leaving the woods gray and skeletal. I'd taken my RV deep into Hoosier National Forest, Indiana, on a solo trip to photograph wildlife. This was my job, my passion, and I'd spent years roaming the country, chasing rare animals and forgotten landscapes. But this trip wasn't just about work. It was about escape. From the noise of the city, from the memories of my brother, and from the guilt that gnawed at me every day since his death. The area I was heading to, Hoosier Hollow, was remote, far from the main trails. I'd read rumors of strange occurrences there, disappearances, bizarre sightings, but that only intrigued me. There were also whispers of a rare species of owl thought to have gone extinct decades ago. The idea of capturing one on camera was enough to push aside my unease. The trouble started before I even set up camp. My RV's battery drained inexplicably when I parked, leaving me without lights or heat. I checked the system, but everything seemed fine. I chalked it up to a bad battery and decided to make do. I set up my camp and began unpacking my gear. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the smell of earth and decaying leaves. The forest around me was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I spent the afternoon hiking, camera slung over my shoulder. The forest was stunning. Mist clung to the ground, like a living thing, swirling around. My boots. I snapped photos of moss-covered logs, twisted roots, and the bare branches clawing at the sky. But something felt off. The shadows seemed too long, the silence too complete. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around dusk, I found a series of footprints near a shallow creek. They were enormous, human-like but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too deep, and the prints ended abruptly, as though the creature had simply vanished. I took a few photos, telling myself they were probably from a prankster or an animal I wasn't familiar with. Still, unease prickled the back of my neck. That night, things got stranger. I sat in the dim light of my lantern, reviewing the day's photos. At first, everything looked normal. Landscapes, close-ups of bark, a few shots of squirrels and deer. But then, I noticed something odd. In one photo of the foggy forest, there was a figure in the background. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a hollowed-out torso that glowed faintly. My first thought was that it had to be an optical illusion, fog and light playing tricks on the lens. But the more I stared, the more my stomach twisted. The figure looked aware. I closed my laptop, my heart racing. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic humming coming from the forest. It was almost human, but too deep, too resonant. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing there. The sound persisted, circling the RV, growing louder, then fading, then growing louder again. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found more of those strange footprints around my campsite. They circled the RV, overlapping as if whatever made them had been pacing. My first instinct was to leave, but my pride and curiosity kept me rooted. I convinced myself that it was all explainable. Maybe the footprints were just a trick of the earth and weather. Maybe the humming was the wind. Maybe the figure in the photo was something else. Determined to shake off my fear, I packed my camera and set off deeper into Hoosier Hollow. The fog was thicker that day, wrapping the forest in an oppressive shroud. As I moved through the trees, I saw movement in the distance, shadows slipping between the trunks. "Deer," I whispered to myself, though I knew it wasn't. The shadows were upright, humanoid, and moved too smoothly to be natural. The further I went, the heavier the air became, pressing against my chest. That's when I saw it again. The figure from my photo. It stood at the edge of a clearing, impossibly tall, its glowing hollow torso casting an eerie light onto the ground. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me, like a weight on my skin. "Hello?" I called out. my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera. When I looked again, it was gone. I should have turned back then. I should have packed up my RV and left Hoosier Hollow behind. But instead, I pushed forward, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. I told myself I needed to understand what I'd seen, to capture it on film, and prove it was real, or that it wasn't. That night, the dreams began. I was in the forest, but it wasn't the same. The trees were blackened and twisted, their branches reaching for me like claws. I heard my brother's voice calling my name, distant and distorted. "Ryan, help me," he said over and over. I ran toward the sound, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't find him. Instead, I found the Hollow Man, standing in the fog, its glowing torso filled with swirling shadows. It raised one elongated arm and pointed at me, and I woke up gasping for air. The next day, the line between dream and reality blurred. I heard my brother's voice while I was awake, faint and pleading, echoing through the forest. "Ryan, why did you leave me?" he asked. Guilt clawed at my chest. I hadn't been there for him when he needed me most. We'd had a stupid argument before he died, and I never got the chance to make it right. Now, it felt like he was haunting me, accusing me. The climax came on my final night in Hoosier Hollow. I was packing up to leave, ready to abandon the trip and all the strange occurrences, when the humming returned. It was louder now, vibrating through the RV. Then came the voice, deep and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. The RV shook violently, and the lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. I grabbed my camera and flashlight, desperate for answers, and stepped outside. The forest was alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees, branches creaking under an invisible weight. And then I saw it. The Hollow Man, standing just beyond the tree line, its glowing torso illuminating the fog. It took a step toward me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the air itself wanted to crush me. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The Hollow Man didn't answer, but its form began to shift. Its face became my brother's, twisted and sorrowful. "You left me," it said in his voice, though the words came from the creature's hollow chest. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean to." The creature stepped closer, its long arms reaching for me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I raised my camera and fired the flash. The bright light seemed to stun it, its form flickering like a broken projection. I fired again and again, each burst of light pushing it further back until it vanished into the fog. Shaking, I ran back to the RV, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Hoosier Hollow. When I reviewed my photos later, I found one clear shot of the Hollow Man, standing tall and ominous in the fog. Below the image, scrawled in what looked like ash, were the words, "Forgive yourself." I don't know what the Hollow Man was, or why it targeted me. But I know this. It forced me to confront my guilt in a way I never thought possible. And, though I escaped Hoosier Hollow with my life, a part of me will always remain there, haunted by the shadows and the secrets they keep. My name is Megan Price, and I was 29 years old when I came face to face with the curse of Stone Hollow Lake. It was supposed to be just another trip, one more entry for my blog, Wandering Wild. I'd built my career on finding off-the-beaten-path destinations and sharing their beauty with my audience. But this trip wasn't about beauty. It became about survival. It was late November, the kind of chilly, misty weather that makes the world feel half forgotten. I'd heard whispers about Stone Hollow Lake, how it was stunningly remote, how its still waters reflected the sky like a perfect mirror. But what really caught my attention were the stories. Some said it was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a woman who drowned there decades ago. It was exactly the kind of eerie, intriguing angle I needed to boost my content. I arrived in the early afternoon, parking my RV near the shore. The lake was breathtaking, surrounded by dense forest and steep ridges. A layer of mist clung to the water, swirling in the cold breeze. It felt like a place out of time, untouched by the modern world. I couldn't believe it was so empty. No other campers, no hikers, nothing. Just me, my gear, and the whisper of the wind. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent hours taking photos, trying to capture the strange light that filtered through the trees. My drone malfunctioned almost immediately, crashing into the lake with an anticlimactic plop. I swore under my breath. It was an expensive piece of equipment, and now I wouldn't have any aerial shots. But I told myself it was fine. I'd make do. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake transformed. The mist thickened, creeping toward the shore like it had a mind of its own. I sat by the water, reviewing my photos on my camera. Most were fine, but a few of them weren't. In some, there were faint shapes in the background, blurs and smudges that looked almost like figures. I deleted them, annoyed at what I thought was a lens glitch, but the unease lingered. I was just settling into the RV for the night when I heard it. Faint whispers, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the sound of water lapping against the shore, but then I realized the whispers were saying my name, Megan. The sound was so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. I locked the RV door and climbed into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. The whispers continued, growing louder as the night wore on, and I swore I heard someone crying. I told myself it was the wind, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I woke to a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, and froze. There were wet footprints leading from the water to the RV. They were bare, human footprints, and they stopped right at my door. My stomach knotted, and I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some prank. Maybe a local had seen me camping here and decided to mess with me. I packed my gear and spent the day hiking around the lake, trying to focus on capturing its beauty. But the strange occurrences kept piling up. While photographing a patch of mossy rocks near the water, I noticed something odd. My reflection in the lake didn't match my movements. When I raised my hand, the reflection didn't. It stood still, staring back at me with a hollow, lifeless gaze. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and when I looked again, the reflection was gone. By the time I returned to the RV, the unease had turned into outright dread. I reviewed my photos again, hoping they'd distract me, but what I saw made my blood run cold. In several shots, there was a woman standing in the background, partially obscured by mist. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair flowed around her like it was underwater. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. Hadn't seen her when I took the photos. She hadn't been there. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers returned, louder now, accompanied by soft crying and the faint sound of water dripping. Objects in the RV began to move on their own. A mug slid across the counter. My flashlight fell from its hook. I locked the doors and windows, but it didn't help. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, squelching in the mud. I peeked out the window, my breath fogging the glass, and saw her. The woman from the photos. She stood waist-deep in the lake, staring at the RV with unblinking eyes. Her lips moved, though I couldn't hear what she was saying. I backed away, my heart hammering, and spent the rest of the night curled up on the bed, gripping my camera like it could somehow protect me. The next morning, I knew I needed to leave. This wasn't just a strange story for my blog. It was something dangerous, something I couldn't explain. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. The tires were stuck in mud that hadn't been there before. It was as if the lake itself was holding me in place. I spent the day searching for a way out, but the forest seemed to twist and shift around me. Every path I took led me back to the lake. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "Megan, come to me." That night the woman came again. This time she stepped out of the water, her dress dripping, her bare feet leaving. Wet prints on the ground. She moved closer, her hollow eyes locked on mine. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice low and distorted. "Why did you disturb me?" I tried to answer, but the words caught in my throat. She stepped closer, raising one hand, and the air grew colder, heavier. "You came to exploit me," she said. "To take what isn't yours." "No," I whispered. "I didn't mean to," she screamed, a sound that echoed through the forest, and I fell to my knees, clutching my ears. Images flashed in my mind. A woman struggling in the water, a man standing on the shore, watching as she drowned. I understood then. She wasn't just a ghost. She was a curse, tied to the lake by betrayal and rage. In desperation, I remembered the visions and the bracelet I'd seen in the flashes. I crawled to the edge of the lake, my hands trembling, and began searching the muddy shoreline. It didn't take long to find it, a small, rusted bracelet tangled in the roots of a tree. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." I tossed the bracelet into the water. The woman paused, her form flickering, and let out a mournful wail before vanishing into the mist. By morning, the RV's engine started without issue, and the mud had disappeared. I left Stone Hollow Lake behind, but it hasn't left me. Back home, I found one last photo on my camera, an image I hadn't taken. It showed the woman standing at the edge of the lake, staring at the camera. Behind her, my own reflection stared back. But it wasn't me. It was her face, her hollow eyes, looking out from my body. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. If you ever find yourself near Stone Hollow Lake, do yourself a favor. Turn back. And whatever you do, don't look into the water. My name is Sam Harper, and I was 42 years old when I came face to face with something I could neither explain nor forget. It happened in the fall of last year, during a solo trip to a place called Raven's Roost in Morgan-Monroe State Forest, Indiana. I had spent years working as a park ranger before becoming a survivalist YouTuber. My channel focused on teaching people how to navigate the wilderness and debunking myths that spooked campers. I'd thought I'd seen it all, and by then, I didn't believe in anything I couldn't see or touch. That trip changed everything. Raven's Roost had a reputation among locals. Stories of glowing lanterns drifting through the woods and people disappearing into thin air. They called it the work of the Witch of Raven's Roost, a woman supposedly executed there in the 1800s. It was the kind of legend that begged to be debunked, and I figured it would make for an excellent video. I'd show my audience how to handle dense, foggy terrain at night, and if I could disprove the legend along the way, even better. I parked my RV at a remote spot on the edge of the forest and set up camp as the sun dipped below the hills. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves. I spent the first day scouting the area, recording segments about fire-starting techniques and compass navigation. The woods were dense, quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, too peaceful, in hindsight. That night, after editing some footage, I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The sky was dark, moonless, and the forest around me seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. Then I saw it, a faint flicker of light through the trees. It was small, like a candle flame, moving steadily deeper into the woods. My first thought was that it was another camper, but I hadn't seen anyone else for miles. "Hello," I called out, my voice carrying through the still air. The light didn't stop. It just kept moving, weaving between the trees. Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed my gear and followed. The light stayed just out of reach, flickering like it was teasing me. I tried to close the distance, but the terrain grew uneven, and I had to watch my step. My compass was useless, its needle spinning wildly. I tried to use landmarks to orient myself, but everything started to look the same. After what felt like hours, I realized I had no idea how far I'd gone or how to get back. The light vanished abruptly, leaving me in total darkness. I stood there, trying to calm my breathing, when I heard it. Soft, melodic singing, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It was faint at first, like the wind carrying a distant tune. But as I strained to listen, the singing grew louder, clearer. It was a woman's voice, beautiful and haunting. I felt an odd pull to move toward it, but something deep in my gut screamed to stay where I was. I turned back the way I thought I had come, determined to return to camp. The woods were utterly silent now, save for the crunch of leaves under my boots. My flashlight began to flicker, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. When I finally found my way back to the RV, it was past midnight. My legs ached, and my nerves were shot. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it, and sat down to review the footage from earlier. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the background of one of my videos, there was a faint light drifting through the trees. It hadn't been there when I was filming. I rewound the clip and played it again, and this time I noticed something else. There was a shadowy figure near the light, barely visible, but unmistakably human-shaped. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it, when a faint tapping sound came from the RV door. I froze. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. My hands shook as I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. There was nothing there, just the empty forest and a rising fog that clung to the ground. I shut the door and locked it again, but the sense of unease lingered. I barely slept that night. The next day, I decided to retrace my steps from the night before. I told myself I was doing it to explain what I'd seen, but deep down, I think I just needed to prove to myself that it wasn't real. I followed the same trail into the woods, this time marking trees with chalk so I wouldn't get lost. The forest felt different in daylight. The air was heavy, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent. As I moved deeper, I began to notice strange carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, crude, but deliberate. I took photos, making a mental note to research them later. Then I found the clearing. It was a small open space surrounded by towering oaks. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone altar, overgrown with moss and vines. I felt a chill as I approached it, my footsteps faltering. The air around the altar was colder, and the fog seemed thicker here. I knelt to examine the stones and found scorch marks as if a fire had burned there long ago. That's when I heard her voice again. "Mistakes must be paid for," she said, her words clear and deliberate. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, and the lanterns appeared, dozens of them, flickering into existence one by one, surrounding me. I stumbled back, panic rising. The singing returned, louder now, and a figure emerged from the fog. She was tall and gaunt, her eyes glowing like embers. Her dress was tattered, clinging to her skeletal frame, and her long hair flowed as if caught in an unseen wind. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She pointed at me with one bony finger. "You left him," she said, her voice dripping with accusation. My throat tightened. The missing hiker, the one I couldn't save. It was the one failure in my ranger career that had haunted me for years. "I tried," I whispered. "I tried to find him." "Not enough," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. The lanterns flared brighter, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward the altar. Desperate, I fumbled for the flare gun in my pack. My hands shook as I loaded it and fired at the base of the altar. The flare ignited the dry moss, and flames licked up the stones. The witch let out a piercing scream, her form flickering and distorting. The lanterns winked out one by one, and the force holding me vanished. I stumbled back, coughing as the fog dissipated. When I returned to the RV, the forest was eerily quiet. I didn't stop to pack. I started the engine and drove until I was miles away. That night, in a motel room far from Raven's Roost, I reviewed my footage. Most of it was corrupted, static and glitches, but one clip remained intact. It showed the clearing, the altar, and the lanterns. And in the final seconds, the witch's face filled the frame, her glowing eyes staring straight at the camera. Never posted that video. Some stories aren't meant to be shared, and some places are better left alone. Raven's Roost is one of them. If you ever hear the lanterns calling, do yourself a favor. Don't follow. And if you see her, run. My name is Daniel Mason, but most people just call me Dan. I was 38 years old when I visited Ironwood Hollow in Hoosier National Forest. It wasn't just another camping trip. It was an exploration, a chance to uncover a piece of forgotten history. I run a blog called Lost Echoes, where I document abandoned places, ghost towns, and old ruins. Ironwood Hollow caught my attention because of its past, a mining town called Griston that had been abandoned for over a century. The stories about the place were the kind of thing I loved to debunk. Ghosts? A cursed whistle? No way, I figured. It would make for great content. I drove my RV deep into the forest, parking it on a narrow path just outside the hollow. The air felt colder there, the dense canopy of trees blocking most of the late autumn sunlight. I spent the afternoon exploring the forest near the site, gathering photos of the old mining equipment that had been left behind to rust in the elements. The place was eerie, no doubt. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or the distant call of a crow. But eerie wasn't supernatural. At least that's what I kept telling myself. By the time the sun set, I was back at the RV reviewing the day's footage. My photos turned out beautifully, moody shots of abandoned cabins and moss-covered tools. But as I flipped through them, one picture made me pause. It was a shot of the mine entrance, a gaping black hole framed by rotted timbers. In the corner of the image, just barely visible, was a faint shape. A figure. I zoomed in, but the image pixelated too much to make out. Details. I chalked it up to shadows playing tricks. That night, as I sat editing videos, I heard it for the first time. A faint whistle drifting through the trees. It was a long, mournful note, followed by silence. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It came again, slightly louder, this time followed by two short notes. It sounded human, deliberate, but I knew there wasn't anyone else around for miles. Wind, I muttered to myself, though my voice felt too loud in the quiet. It's just the wind. I tried to go back to editing, but the whistle continued, growing fainter, as if it were moving deeper into the woods. My curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight and camera, I stepped out into the cool night air. The forest was alive with shadows cast by the pale moonlight, and the whistle seemed to call me forward. I followed it, telling myself I was just investigating. Maybe it was an animal, or some weird acoustics caused by the hollow. The path led me back to the abandoned cabins. They looked different at night, the broken windows like dark, hollow eyes staring out of the shadows. I noticed claw marks etched into the wood of one doorframe, deep and ragged, like someone or something had been trying to get in. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the whistle stopped. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Then, the whistle came again, closer this time. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the trees. There was nothing there, just the mist curling through the underbrush. My gut told me to go back to the RV, but I was too stubborn to leave without answers. I headed toward the mine. The mine entrance was a black hole in the earth, the wooden beams framing it warped and cracked with age. As I approached, I noticed faint carvings in the wood, symbols I didn't recognize, like crude runes or sigils. The whistle was louder here, echoing faintly from the depths of the mine. I peered inside, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the void. No answer, just the soft drip of water and the faint whistle, deeper inside. Against my better judgment, I stepped in. The walls of the mine were slick with moisture, and the floor was uneven, littered with old tools and debris. My boots crunched on the gravel as I followed the sound. It was rhythmic now, almost hypnotic, like it was drawing me further in. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the light, a shadow moved, a tall, humanoid figure that seemed to flicker like a mirage. I froze, gripping my flashlight tighter. The figure didn't move closer, but its presence was palpable, a weight in the air. The whistle stopped abruptly, and the silence was worse. I took a step back, and the ground gave way beneath me. I fell, landing hard on a lower level of the mine. Pain shot through my ankle, and I swore under my breath. My flashlight had rolled away, its beam illuminating the jagged walls of the cavern. When I reached for it, my hand brushed something cold and metallic, a rusted pickaxe. The whistle resumed, impossibly loud now, reverberating through the cavern. I turned the flashlight toward the sound and saw the figure again, closer this time. Its features were indistinct, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. It stepped forward, and I scrambled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice trembled. The figure didn't speak, but I felt its intent, a crushing sense of betrayal and anger that wasn't my own. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in, the air growing colder. My mind raced. The symbols at the mine entrance, the strange markings in the cabin, they had to mean something. I remembered the stories I'd read about the Whistling Man, how he'd betrayed his fellow miners for a stash of gold, leading them to their deaths in a cave-in, the curse tied to his greed, his restless spirit. Desperate, I looked around the cavern and spotted a chunk of ore glinting faintly in the flashlight beam. Gold, the source of the betrayal. I grabbed it, ignoring the sharp edges that cut into my palm, and held it up. The figure hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing. The carvings, the curse. They weren't just warnings, they were part of a ritual. I fumbled for my lighter, sparks flaring as I ignited a small flame. Using the rusted pickaxe and the gold, I scratched a crude replica of the symbols I'd seen onto the cavern floor. The figure screamed, a sound that reverberated through my very bones, and the cavern began to shake. The whistle reached a deafening pitch as I lit the symbols on fire, the flames flickering weakly in the damp air. The figure lunged toward me, but as the flames grew, it stopped, writhing and flickering like smoke caught in a gust. With a final ear-splitting whistle, it vanished, leaving only silence. I dragged myself out of the mine, my ankle throbbing and my heart pounding. The forest was still, the mist beginning to lift. When I reached my RV, the engine started without hesitation, and I didn't look back as I drove away. Back home, I reviewed my footage. Most of it was corrupted, filled with static and distorted images. But in one clip, as I turned the camera toward the mine, the figure was there, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath. Some stories are better left untold. Ironwood Hollow is one of those places. If you ever hear the whistle, don't follow it. And whatever you do, stay away from the mine. My name is Elena Morales, and I was 33 years old when I saw the shadow in Clear Creek Gorge. It was late October, the perfect time for fieldwork in the forest. The crisp air, the golden leaves, everything felt alive. I had come to Yellowwood State Forest to study a rare bird species rumored to nest in the cliffs around the gorge. It wasn't just research for my work as a field biologist. It was a chance to escape, to be alone in nature, to avoid the gnawing guilt that had haunted me for years. 2 years earlier, a hiker had died during one of my projects. I wasn't responsible, not directly, but I had been part of the search team. We didn't find him until it was too late, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more. I told myself this trip was about the birds, about my work, but I think part of me hoped that being here, alone in the wilderness, would give me peace. Clear Creek Gorge was beautiful in its ruggedness. The cliffs loomed high above the forest floor, their rocky faces streaked with moss and lichen. A shallow stream snaked through the gorge, its water clear and cold. I parked my RV in a small clearing just outside the trailhead, a secluded spot with just enough room for my gear. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were the rustle of the trees and the occasional call of a bird. It was perfect. The first day went smoothly. I spent hours hiking the trails, setting up cameras to capture footage of the birds. The cliffs were steep, but I knew how to navigate them, carefully placing each step on the loose gravel. By dusk, I was back at the RV, reviewing the footage. Most of it was ordinary, shots of trees swaying in the breeze, a squirrel darting past the lens. But one clip gave me pause. It was a wide shot of the gorge, taken from the trail above. Near the edge of the cliff, a shadow lingered. It was tall and human-shaped, but slightly indistinct, like it wasn't fully there. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. It had to be a trick of the light, maybe the shadow of a tree. I deleted the clip and moved on, but the image stuck with me. That night, the forest seemed different. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. As I lay in bed, the wind picked up, rattling the trees outside. I tried to sleep, but a sound kept pulling me back to consciousness. A faint whisper, barely audible, drifting through the stillness. At first I thought it was the wind, but it didn't fade. It grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, or voices, pleading, though I couldn't make out the words. I sat up, my heart pounding, and peered out the RV window. The forest was still. No movement, no sign of anyone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of being alone in the dark. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. The next day I explored the gorge more thoroughly, climbing down to the stream that cut through its center. The cliffs rose high on either side, their surfaces dotted with small caves. It was here that the birds were supposed to nest, though I hadn't seen any yet. I spent hours documenting the area, taking notes and setting up additional cameras. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Near midday, I noticed something odd. My watch, a reliable tool I'd used for years, was running slow, by almost 2 hours. My GPS was glitching, its signal weak, despite the open sky. I shrugged it off, blaming the thick forest canopy and my long days in the field. But as the sun dipped lower, the unease returned. On my way back to the RV, I saw the shadow again. This time it wasn't in my footage. It was on the cliff ahead of me, standing perfectly still. My first instinct was to call out, but the words caught in my throat. Something about it was wrong. It didn't move, didn't sway with the wind. It was just there, watching. I hurried back to camp, the shadow burning in my mind. That night, the whispers returned. Louder now, more distinct. "Help me," they said. "Don't leave me." The voice was faint, fragmented, but it felt real. I stayed in the RV, clutching my flashlight, too scared to step outside. I didn't sleep at all. On the third day, I decided to confront the fear. Maybe it was exhaustion or frustration, but I couldn't take the whispers, the shadow, the feeling of being watched. I needed answers. As dusk approached, I packed my gear, camera, flashlight, journal, and headed back into the gorge. The light was fading fast when I reached the cliff where I'd seen the shadow. The air was cold, and the forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I stood at the edge of the cliff, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing. Then, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, I saw it. The shadow stepped forward from the cliff's edge, its form flickering like smoke. It was tall, human-shaped, but featureless, its edges dissolving into the air. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer, but the whispers returned, louder now, all around me. "You left me," they said. "You let me die." My knees buckled as the words hit me, and I realized what it was. Not a ghost. Not just a shadow. It was grief, guilt, the echo of the hiker I couldn't save. It had taken form, feeding on my regret. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I tried. I didn't mean to leave you." The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and writhing. I felt its anger, its sorrow, its desperation. I reached into my pack and pulled out my research journal, the one where I'd documented every bird, every detail of my work. It was my way of preserving life, of making something meaningful out of my mistakes. "I'll honor you," I said, placing the journal on the cliff's edge. "I promise." The shadow paused, its form softening. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved into the night, leaving only the rustle of the wind. I stood there for a long time, the weight on my chest lifting. When I finally returned to the RV, the forest felt different, lighter. The oppressive energy was gone. Back home, I reviewed my footage. Most of it was normal, but one clip stood out, a single, fleeting image of the shadow, standing at the cliff's edge, with the faint outline of a figure beside it. It wasn't angry anymore. It was at peace. I never published the footage. Some stories are too personal, too sacred to share. But I'll never forget what I saw in Clear Creek Gorge. If you ever go there, remember this. The shadows might not be what they seem. Sometimes they're just waiting for you to listen. My name is Matthew Reed, and I was 40 years old when I crossed paths with the toll keeper of Devil's Gate. I wasn't looking for anything supernatural. I was looking for a story. That's my job. Digging into forgotten places, peeling back the layers of history, and sharing what I find with an audience hungry for the strange and the obscure. Devil's Gate seemed like a perfect subject, a remote stretch of land in Obannon Woods State Park, Indiana, where travelers once paid tolls to pass through. The toll keeper was infamous, a figure of local legend who supposedly cheated and tormented those who couldn't pay. Some say his ghost still lingers, demanding payment from anyone who dares to trespass. It sounded like nonsense, of course, a spooky campfire tale. But spooky sells. So, on a crisp October morning, I packed up my RV, double-checked my gear, and drove deep into the park. Finding the old toll road was harder than I expected. The directions I'd found online were vague at best, and the map I was using didn't quite match the terrain. My GPS wasn't much help, constantly recalculating as if unsure of where I was. I eventually found a narrow dirt road that seemed promising. The forest grew denser as I drove, the trees pressing closer, their branches intertwining overhead. The road twisted and turned, and just when I was beginning to second-guess myself, I saw it. the ruins of a small stone structure, partially hidden by overgrowth. The toll station. I parked the RV nearby and stepped outside. The air was colder than it should have been for the season, with a dampness that clung to my skin. The stone structure was little more than a crumbling shell, its roof long gone, its walls blackened as if by fire. I took out my camera and began snapping photos, narrating into my recorder. The first day passed without incident. I explored the area, finding old wagon wheel ruts in the dirt and a few rusted tools buried beneath the leaves. The history was fascinating. Isolated travelers, disputes over tolls, a man said to have grown rich off the misery of others. But nothing unusual happened, nothing that couldn't be explained. I went to bed that night feeling confident I'd have enough material for my article. Then the bell rang. It was faint at first, just a single soft chime that seemed to drift through the trees. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It came again. Louder this time, a clear ringing sound like a small brass bell being struck. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was silent, the air colder than before. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no source for the sound. I chalked it up to an animal or the wind and went back inside. The next morning I discovered my wallet was missing. I tore through the RV, searching every nook and cranny, but it was gone. It didn't make sense. I hadn't left the vehicle all night except to investigate the bell. Frustrated but determined, I decided to press on. I spent the day hiking the old toll road, following its winding path through the forest. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The ground was littered with debris, broken wheels, shattered glass, things that looked like they'd been abandoned long ago. My compass needle spun uselessly, and the GPS had given up entirely. I started marking trees with chalk to avoid getting lost. That's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, imprinted in the soft dirt of the path. Large, heavy, like a man's. Boots. But they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped, as if the person had vanished into thin air. I took a photo, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I told myself it was just an old impression, preserved by the damp ground. Nothing to worry about. That night, the bell rang again, louder, closer. I sat in the RV, staring out the window, waiting for something to happen. The bell rang 3 times, its tone sharp and commanding, and then everything went quiet. Too quiet. Even the insects had stopped. That's when I saw him. A shadowy figure stood by the toll station ruins, barely visible in the moonlight. He wore what looked like a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his outline flickering like a mirage. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned as if sensing me and began walking toward the RV. I panicked. Grabbing my flashlight, I threw open the door and stepped outside. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The figure stopped. For a moment it seemed to waver, as if it were part of the fog that now clung to the ground. Then it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I returned to the ruins, determined to get to the bottom of this. I found more signs of the past. Wagon ruts, broken tools. But something about the place felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. And then I heard it again. The bell. It came from deeper in the forest, a steady, rhythmic tolling that made my stomach churn. I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush until I reached a clearing. In the center stood a rusted iron bell, hanging from a wooden frame. The tollkeeper's bell. My breath caught as I approached. It shouldn't have been there. This wasn't in any of the historical records I'd read. The ground around it was littered with coins, rusted and tarnished, as if offerings had been left behind. The air grew colder, and the forest fell silent. Then, a voice, low, gravelly, filled with malice. "You owe a toll." I turned, and there he was, The tollkeeper. His face was obscured, his body a dark mass of shadow and smoke, but his eyes burned red like embers. He raised one hand, pointing at me. "You crossed my road," he said. "Now you must pay." My legs felt like lead, but I managed to speak. "I don't have anything to give." The tollkeeper stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "Then I will take what is mine." The bell began to ring again, louder and faster, its sound filling the clearing. The coins on the ground shook, and I felt an unbearable weight pressing down on me. Desperate, I reached into my bag and pulled out my journal, the one where I documented every trip, every story. It was my most valuable possession, the thing that defined me. I held it out. "Take this," I said, my voice breaking. "It's all I have." The tollkeeper paused. His fiery eyes flickered, and the ringing stopped. He reached out, his hand passing through the journal as if it was smoke. The weight lifted, and the forest seemed to exhale. "Go," he said, his voice echoing like a distant storm. "And remember." The tollkeeper turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing, like mist. The bell went silent. I stumbled back to the RV, my heart pounding. My journal was gone, replaced by a blank notebook. The road out of Devil's Gate was clear now, the forest no longer twisting to trap me. I didn't look back as I drove away. Still think about that trip, about what I saw and what I lost. I didn't just lose a journal, I lost a part of myself. But I gained something too. A reminder that some stories are more than just legends, some roads are more than just paths, and some tolls demand to be paid,